Hello, and welcome to the Future Tourism Podcast. My name is David Peacock. My guest today is a fellow Canadian, an award-winning journalist, and he's the European Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail newspaper. He appears regularly on CTV, BBC, and his career includes stints with the Times of London, the Financial Post, and the Financial Times of Canada. Eric Reguly was born in Vancouver and grew up in Toronto, and now lives in Rome as the European Bureau Chief for the Globe. Good morning, Eric. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Where are you this morning?
I'm in my home office in Rome. It's a beautiful, clear, cool day. And otherwise, nothing is exciting in my life. Rome's pretty much dead at the moment. There's pretty much zero tourists. And so we're all, like everyone else, just waiting for the vaccine to bring us back to life.
So are you still keeping your pandemic diary?
I am a bit less frequently, but I will update it soon. I have some friends, and all the journalists in Rome are keeping pandemic diaries, and one of my best friends in Rome, who's a Brit and who's a full-time book writer, unlike me, is actually turning his plague diary into a book. It should be out pretty soon. I probably should have done the same, but I consider it just a minor part of my existence.
Well, I've been following it, and it was exciting, in the early days when you talk about going out for a walk in the empty streets and using your press pass to get outside. That's become a bit more pedestrian over time, hasn't it? It's novel to begin with, and now it's like, yeah, we are again.
Yeah, I wouldn't say unlike the spring when, listen, in March and April, the scenes of army trucks filled with coffins going to hospitals and coming back with those same coffins loaded with bodies and then going into communal pits. That was horrifying. I mean, when the pandemic was just roaring through Europe, especially northern Italy, we were terrified. We didn't know how bad it was. We didn't know the fatality rates. We didn't think the fatality rates would be as low as they ended up being. Now we're, well into the second wave, and it's like, here we go again. It's lockdown fatigue. We know it's not going to kill, 99% of us. So I'm honestly a bit more relaxed about it. Mostly I'm bored. My job is traveling. I cover, 40, 50 countries in the Mediterranean, Europe, Middle East, North Africa. And my last trip out of Italy was in February. So I'm raring to go again, but it's not going to happen anytime soon.
So today I want to talk to you about something you've been writing about for a while. I want to talk to you about cities and the pivot they've made either pre-COVID or in COVID. And I want to relate that to tourism, because a lot of these cities are tourism destinations. And just as you point out in your article, cities are busy trying to understand their current environment, understand their future environment, understand their role and function. The same thing's going on with destination organizations. To some extent, many of them are rudderless, waiting for this to play out. And in another more positive sense, many of them are hard at work on trying to reinvent themselves. So one of your favorite heroes, you say, is Miguel Ángel Fernández Lores, a minor socialist politician in Pontevedra, Spain. 20 years ago, he, quote, ended the city's status as a car warehouse. That's an article you wrote in the Globe about 3 weeks ago. Tell us about Pontevedra.
Well, honestly, I've not been there, but I've been reading about this mayor, Loris, God, for at least 5 or 6 years, because I like cities. I'm very much an urban creature, and I've lived in 12 cities in 4 countries, and I have an idea of what works and doesn't work, as as a professional for the most part, but also as a tourist. I consider this mayor. So Pontevedra is in just north of the Portuguese border in northwestern Spain. Population about 88,000. Not a big city. It was car choked. He's a socialist. He came in 1999. He had a vision, a plan. He put it in place overnight, and he said, the historic center, we're not going to tweak, we're going to nuke. And they just got rid of all the cars overnight in the historic center. And there was a lot of resistance to it, but he called the center dead. He's brought it back alive. And now, I'm a business economic journalist mostly, but instead of killing the city, it did the opposite. Retail sales per square meter or square foot, however you want to measure it, rose dramatically. The air became more breathable. The place became more greener. He added, the spots that were devoted to parking became bicycle lanes and green area, and it saved the city. And Paris is doing the same now. But I mean, what I like is about this mayor in Portugal is that he figured this out 20 years before the mayor of Paris figured this out, or the mayor of London figured this out. No one paid attention to him, right? So I haven't interviewed him, but I'm wondering what he's thinking now. Like, he must be thinking, guys, what took you 20 years? I did it first.
Well, you point out in that article that many cities are looking at models like that, and they're considering how they reinvent themselves. And you're talking about how, in particular, COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated that thinking. What do you see there?
Depends on the city, but what the pandemic did in Europe overnight was it made people afraid of commuting, of public transportation, of office towers. So those three things. So all of a sudden, the people wanted to work and live in their communities as opposed to traveling. So what this did immediately was, virtually overnight, was create a bike culture. You cannot get bikes in Europe now. I mean, I ordered a new bike in August. It has not arrived because the manufacturers are flat out. So in all these cities, in the big cities, hundreds or thousands of kilometers new bike lanes are coming in. I'm in Rome. 150 new kilometers came in pretty fast of new bike lanes. So that's been a huge net positive as far as I'm concerned. Cars are a little less popular, which is really good. And I think that this trend will accelerate down the road as people, because not everyone's going to go back to their offices. Some will, but who knows? A certain percentage will not. So you're going to go back to the old Jane Jacobs model of living and working in your own immediate community. And I think that's great for the environment. It's great for.
So let's tell people who Jane Jacobs was.
Okay, Jane Jacobs, who died about 10 years ago, was probably the most famous American urbanologist. She wrote a famous book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. In the 1960s, when urban planners were absolutely obsessed with connecting cities to the suburbs with huge freeways, a freeway was going to go from Long Island right through southern Manhattan, which is what is now Soho and Greenwich Village, to go to New Jersey. And I forget the name of that project. I think it was Long Island Expressway. And she organized mass protests to stop it. It would have obliterated southern Manhattan. In the late 60s, I think 69, she moved to Toronto. She did the same with the Spadina Expressway. She stopped it.
I read that the other night in one of your pieces. So if the city had its way in 69, the Spadina Avenue would have become what, a raised elevated expressway like the Gardner?
Yeah, it would have come right through the western side of the city into downtown.
Wow.
I mean, you look what the Gardner's done to Toronto. It's wrecked the waterfront, but also the Don Valley Expressway. They put in Toronto. The Don Valley Expressway went down through what could have been the most beautiful park in North America.
The most beautiful valley in Toronto, absolutely.
Yeah, it's now a highway. So she stopped She stopped the one on the other side of the city.
Well, it's interesting to see Boston actually spend so much time and effort in the big dig to get rid of their elevated expressway. If they, they talk about one thing, it's elevated expressways are really hard to maintain and visually quite horrible, especially when they're between you and the waterfront.
Yeah. So look at Chicago's waterfront compared to Toronto. Toronto
Yeah.
is condos and cars. You can't even see Lake Ontario. It's a shame, absolute shame.
So you talk about Jane Jacobs being vindicated in some sense, in this shift, and then you talk specifically about Paris and Milan beginning to push what they call the 15-minute city. What is the 15-minute city?
Does not have a precise definition. A 15-minute city is a concept that Jane Jacobs would have approved of because she believed in living in multi-use neighborhoods where you lived and worked in the same area. The 15-minute city is designed to give you access to all essential services, healthcare, banks, shopping, entertainment within 15 minutes, schools, 15 minutes on foot or by bicycle. This is how cities used to work before the advent of the car, and Paris in particular is trying to go back to that model. It's not going to be easy. Milan also is trying to get to that model. Not going to be easy either, but it's a great concept, and it will environmentally it's a good concept. Socially, it's a good concept, but it's gonna recreate local communities. Remember, London, England used to be that. It used to be there was no such thing as London. It was a collection of high streets with villages, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the idea is to get back to that.
I had a peer I used to work with years ago, and he had a famous saying that I loved, which was, he said, as human beings, we're fascinated by towns and villages that are built on a human scale, and
Yeah,
I love that.
yeah. That's why I absolutely adore Venice. It's medium density. There's no skyscrapers. Rome, where I live, is the only capital city in the world without a skyscraper in it.
Well, so let's think about that. I'd almost say in the lee of the COVID-19 crisis. We're not in the lee of it. We won't be in the lee of it for some time. But when we're in the lee of the COVID-19 crisis, destinations and organizations all over the world are looking at reinventing themselves. Some are more in lockstep with the cities and places they represent, but truthfully, a very small percent are that closely aligned with their businesses, their citizens, and their government. So let's talk about the Venice example. You wrote an excellent piece in the Globe on Venice. I think the number that jumped out that hit me the hardest was this: the average ratio of tourists to residents in Venice on a given day is 500 to 1.
Yes. So my story on Venice is I started going to Venice as a kid in the early 70s. I've probably been there 30 or 40 times. It was my favorite city in the world. When mass tourism took over and the cruise ships took over in the 1990s, I pretty much stopped going, except as a journalist to chronicle its demise. In recent years, I hated the city. I just no interest in going there whatsoever. It became a dead city. Now, listen, Venice was always a tourist center, but it wasn't mass tourism that came now, that has come now. And when I went back during the pandemic in late spring or early summer, I just found it magical again, absolutely magical. Because, look, and I felt sorry for a lot of the closed shops, but Venetians are coming back and reclaiming their city, and I absolutely love that. And my theory, in a sentence, is that Venice should be the model city of the 21st century.
So when you visited Venice, you made a number of you had a number of meetings there. Venturini is a guy who stands out in my mind. I think he's the deputy mayor.
Yes.
So he said essentially that Venice has always been trying to find its way back, but the work to date was tinkering. He said the city needs a whole new approach to tourism, which would see fewer big cruise ships, Airbnbs, fewer day trippers, and a greater focus on cultural visits and education, and the launch of a technology hub that might concentrate on the green economy, such as electric boats. Is that possible? Is he working towards that? Is that aspirational? Tell me what you think.
It is possible. I am worried that a vaccine is going to bring Venice back to what it was. There's some chance it won't. Listen, Italy is complicated. The Venetians want to stop the cruise boats, but that's not a local law. That's a federal law. The ports are federal infrastructure. Unless the government in Rome says no, they're going to keep on coming. What Venice is doing is putting a head tax on tourists coming off the boats, but it's minimal. It's a few euros a head. If it were 100 euros a head, it might do so. But look, here's what I think. Young people, especially. I'm an old guy, but young people, especially, they're like my daughters, my late teens. They don't want cars. They don't want driver's license. They're never going to get driver's license. They're never going to own a car. My youngest daughter is searching for a campus in a city that's not plugged with traffic. She's actually looking at the University of Venice. Why? Because you can walk out the streets and not see, hear, or smell traffic and the pollution that's created by it. So I think Venice could be, with some imagination, could be a thriving center for technology, for education, for the environment. And I think there is some chance it could go that way, given the right bylaws, the right tax structure, and a mayor who has no conflict, who's not wired into the local big business community.
So that's a really good point, that nationally Venice is a economic engine that just churns through money. But locally, when you have to live in it, you wrote a really pithy paragraph that said most Venetians aren't convinced the municipal, regional, and national governments really cared about the future of Venice. Their argument is that if they had, they would have put some checks on mass tourism and ensured things like the on-time completion of the tide control barriers, which we know last year in November, Venice just got hammered with floods, a project that's years and years behind. Essentially saying, in the choice between tourism and tide control, the city of Venice chose tourism, and more important infrastructure pieces were let lagging, which just speaks to essentially, optimizing the output of that tourism asset, but not taking care of it.
Yeah, well, it was greed, David. It just, when you say optimizing the tourism choice, it was just greed. I mean, the fastest way to milk Venice for every euro that it can produce is to embrace mass tourism. It costs nothing, right? You open the port to monster ships. 5,000 tourists being barfed out at once. You let people turn their apartments into Airbnbs, which has happened with zero controls. There were no controls on it. Many cities like Paris limit the Airbnb nights to a certain percentage here. I can't remember, it was a third or a half, but there are some reasonable limits on it. There was nothing on that. There was no investment in saying tourism is inevitable. What kind of tourism do we want? What I find weird about Venice is that not only is it mobbed with tourism, but it's mobbed with tourism in a very small area in Venice. It's Piazza San Marco, St. Mark's Square, the Doge's Palace, but there's some wonderful museums where no one goes to, just a little bit out of that, the central heart there. And, that's selfie tourism. They didn't go after the cultural tourist. They went after the day trippers.
So you talk about, I've heard you talk about Amsterdam as a more diversified economy, and a place, and it's actually in my mind, I hold the two of them close to each other because they're two of the strangest, most purpose-built cities I've ever met. I can't imagine why you fight back, the ocean in either case to create the stretch of land, but I've
Yeah.
come to understand it over the years, and I didn't understand Amsterdam. It took me years to understand that Amsterdam was built as the residents, the locals, moved offshore to avoid the marauding Moors who would come down every 600 years and just knock the heck out of them. So they moved off into the swamp, so to speak, and built on stilts. But Amsterdam has a more diversified economy. It is a tech center. It is a business center. It is a tourism center. Talk to me about Amsterdam.
Okay, I don't know Amsterdam nearly as well as Venice, though. I go there probably once a year. Amsterdam made a choice not to go for strictly mass tourism, and I mean Amsterdam has everything. I mean, it has all sorts of industries, and Venice could have been that way. Now, I'm not sure about Amsterdam, whether it's tax structure or limits on Airbnbs. I suspect both, but they've kept businesses beyond cheapo hot dog stands and pizzerias, and it has worked. I mean, Amsterdam is really small. I mean, the historic center is probably smaller than Venice. So they really, really had to control it. They did a good job of getting rid of cars, though. But my point is, I don't understand tourism, David. I don't get it. I
Well,
mean,
good. And this is why I got you here today. And this is a bit of a sobering discussion for all of us on this end. The industry we work in really aspirationally wants to be a better industry, wants to have authentic senses of place and connect with locals. But that's something that really became vogue in the last 3 or 4 years. The idea that tourism had a responsibility to its place, and that if it didn't enrich the life of citizens or make stakeholder businesses more profitable or effective, then really what was it? But I will tell you that's a relatively new concept of tourism. Now there are great little places around the world that have been practicing it all along, but for the most part, you're seeing a scaled down version of Venice, where certain things make money, do those things. So I'm going to ask you, as the Global Mail bureau chief in Europe, talk to me about your perception of tourism. I think the leaders in our industry need to hear it from outside. We spend a lot of time worrying about this. We spend a lot of time convinced that we're right on it and changing it. But what is the perception of tourism from the non-industry person?
a net negative for society, um, even possibly even for the economy. Let me just give you if we have another few minutes, my perspective. I moved to Rome 13 years ago. Been here a long time, actually an Italian citizen. I loved Rome when I came here because Rome was not overwhelmed with tourism. There was always a lot of tourism here. But what was special about historic Rome, which is Rome within the walls, pretty big, probably the biggest historic center in Europe, maybe the world, was that actual Romans lived in historic Venice, had not turned into a Venice, had not turned into a Florence. Romans lived there. They had their favorite restaurants, their cafes. It was their city, and tourists were guests. As mass tourism came in, the chain stores came in, the locals moved out. The restaurants catered to people who would buy one meal and could never come back again. The cliche was in Rome you could not get a bad meal. Now the saying in Rome is you can only get a bad meal because they're not catering to the Romans. Central Rome is in danger of becoming a dead city. And what I don't understand about tourism is, to me, tourism is seeing how the locals live. I mean, if you go to Venice, Florence, and even Rome now, you're not getting a sense of that, because there are no Romans left. Really, they're moving out. Of course, there are. I'm exaggerating to make a point, but fewer and fewer of them. So that experience of seeing how the locals live is gone. So you're missing that whole cultural experience, and you're getting you remember the Audrey Hepburn movies, Holiday in Rome. I mean, tourists would come for a week or 2 weeks, and they would spend. There are 200 museums in Rome, maybe 5 get visited. Um, when I say I don't understand tourism, I don't understand what a day tripper tourism is getting out of the Rome experience, because there's no exposure to the locals, and it's a rapid jaunt through the highlights, and there's no desire to learn the history, to experience. I mean, every brick, every road, every piece of masonry in the city's got 2,000 to 3,000 years of history of it. There's a story everywhere, but no one's getting it anymore. So I think but this, how do I argue this? It means you sound like a damn snob, because basically to get cultural tourists back, you have to raise prices, right?
Well, we know one thing coming out of the pandemic, which is prices on tourism have to be raised. There's no way we can service at the same level with the same amenities at the same price anymore. And so hopefully with that influx of some new resources, some of this changes. I hear that plea for authenticity in almost every tourism discussion or conference I go to. People like yourselves, like myself, want to go to places and be immersed in culture. Those of us that are really on that bent tend to tiptoe around the best of showings and try and find those little places off the beaten track for the authentic meal, etc. But what would Mayor Fernandez Flores say in Pontevedra about tourism? What do you think he would say in a town that reinvented itself, took away the car because it was sapping the lifeblood out of the city? What do you think the role of tourism would or should be in a well-planned community like that?
Okay, I'm imagining, because I've never met him, I hope to, that I imagine he would say, and Hidalgo of Paris would probably say the same thing, that not getting rid of tourism, downplaying tourism, mass tourism is not going to kill your city. In fact, it could do the opposite, because guess what? As he found in Spain, that retail sales soared when he got rid of cars, right? So I don't know if those are tourists; those are probably locals, right? So reclaiming the city for the locals is also going to bring in business. It's also going to give a more authentic experience to the tourists. I think that the same thing could happen in the larger cities in Europe.
So I'll give you a little bit of glimmer of hope on that one. A friend of mine, Signe Jungerstedt, who worked for Copenhagen, in 2017, her organization declared the end of tourism as we know it in Copenhagen. And they said, we're not asking you to come and be tourists anymore. We want you to become and be locals. It's a statement. It's not an entire shift, but the statement precipitated a shift to the idea of localhood. And they've been focused ever since on coming to Copenhagen, finding a way to treat the visitor as a local and immerse them in that culture. It's happening. It's catching on in bits and pieces around the world. It's not ubiquitous next.
I'll take your word for it, but it sounds like a lovely concept to me. But
Well,
I just think I'm a cynical journalist. I mean, it's just that greed always wins out in the end. I mean, the easy option wins. I mean, how are you going to stop the ships? I don't know.
In parallel to that, you know that Victoria is working very, very hard on trying to figure out its new role and function. Taking away the ships from Victoria took, the bulk of their visiting public out, but at the same time, they got a bit of a Venice moment, and they got to see the city without that pressure. And there's a lot of support for the idea that they can't go back to the mass cruise ship business that they had before. Now, like you, I don't know where it goes next, but I can tell you that movement's growing.
Well, I'm very pleased to see that. I just think that mayors, and more so in Europe than, I don't know about North America, because I haven't lived there for so long. I mean, it's just an eternal quest for more revenue, but I don't think they realize that by reducing mass tourism doesn't mean reducing revenue. That other business, like it's not just like in Rome, it's not just Romans leaving the center, it's also the businesses that they ran leaving the center. Like, okay, for example, there's a famous hat shop where Woody Allen used to buy all his hats in Rome. It's very close to Piazza di Spagna. It's gone, right? Because his type of tourist, the one who appreciated culture and craftsmanship, wanted to spend money, that disappeared, and those shops are disappearing with them. These are the day trippers don't buy beautiful, elegant clothing. They buy crap. They buy I don't know, the underwear with an Italian flag on it. So it's when you're getting rid of mass tourism, the locals are going to come back, but also the businesses are going to come back, and that will rebuild the tax base, because what all mayors want is a tax base.
Well, and I think you touch on what the future of tourism really is, in the sense that if you want to experience a place authentically, if you want to rebuild it authentically, you have to work with the businesses that are authentic business. And I think of Parma and Reggio and how exciting it was the first time I ever went to those cities and realized that the cheeses I was eating or the breads I was eating were named after places, and those places were so rooted in the tradition of that food. I think one of the movements that's taking place in North America right now that can be helpful is destinations are looking at the businesses that are in their communities and saying, post-pandemic, our job is to help these businesses survive, but it's also to communicate and share the authenticity of these businesses. And I think that might be a silver lining. We talk about trying to align with community values and a sense of shared prosperity for everybody. Those are goals. Those aren't things to do. The tools that might get us there are perhaps working more closely with mayors and working more closely with city councils, but most importantly, working more closely with businesses, because they're the ones with the lights always on. They're the ones who serve not just the visitor, but the local as well.
Yeah. My favorite, just to finish off, David, my favorite cities in Italy are the ones that have decided not to pursue mass tourism. They're all three of them are big cities, but can you guess which three are my favorite in Italy?
Okay, Portofino.
No, I'm talking about big cities. These are
big
three cities in Italy that have not completely surrendered to mass tourism, and I find them much more interesting than the cities that have.
So Milan.
For sure, yeah.
Okay.
It's kept its productive base. It's a thriving economy, and I find it really. And you can walk along a street and see a guy who's been there for 100 years building bespoke racing bikes. It's not a pizzeria. Okay.
Second one. Verona.
No, I'm talking major city.
Okay, I'm gonna all of the ones I've been to are gonna be smaller, because I'm thinking Pisa, Verona.
Go on. Naples.
Naples? Really? Naples hasn't given into that pressure, essentially.
No, not as much. No, not nearly as much as Rome, Florence, Venice, Verona. I thought there's an authenticity in Naples, which I really look. It's an hour train ride from Rome. We go often, or we did before the pandemic, even for lunch. It's still, the neighborhoods are still Italian.
Cool.
And Palermo, is the capital of Sicily, which again, yes, they all get tourism, but not to the degree that the northern cities get. Partly a perception in Naples and Sicily that it's run by the mafia, and I think that's scared from they watch these mafia movies like The Godfather. They're like, oh, we're going to get gunned down there. That's not true,
Yes.
So, but those cities that have not completely surrendered to mass tourism.
Well, and I'll add one to that list, and I don't know if it's ostensibly French or Italian anymore, which is Ajaccio in Corsica. Has always been one of my favorite places to visit, and it's a little bit, like the early British Empire. It's a little too far off the coast to be overrun all the time. You got to make an effort to get there, but Corsica is still one of my favorite places in Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. Another city is Turin, Torino, which is
Yep.
more, it's like Paris, like 50 years ago. Again, it's a little bit off the beaten track, but utterly wonderful.
And you know what isn't bad either is Malaga in Spain is a refreshing alternative for a city that's a living, working center, but at the same time a fascinating place to go.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of Spain, we could talk about Barcelona. I mean, I've only been there 3 or 4 times, but my last trip there, I was horrified. It was just overwhelmed with tourism. Oh, absolutely
So
overwhelmed. And the locals were getting angry. They were getting resentful of tourists. There were anti-tourist protests going
yes,
on.
yeah.
And that's a city that took a good thing and just destroyed it.
Well, and you talked with me briefly about that before, which is, the Olympics is such a, golden brand, so to speak, but it can have such negative effects. I got to go to Barcelona shortly after the Olympics, and it was magnificent. I mean, its scale, you just can't imagine that somewhere in the 16 and 1700s was building 5-lane wide streets. I mean, it speaks to the majesty of that empire. And then with the fittings that they put in for the Olympics, the brilliant Frank Gehry sculptures down by the waterfront, it was truly an
Mhm.
amazing city and relatively empty of tourists in that short period just after the Olympics. I did go back a year ago, and it was jammed to the hilt, line up for everything, 2 hours in line to go to the Sagrada Familia, and even the lineups to get into Park Güell. It's not the same place it was 15 years ago.
No, I have no interest in going back. None
And
will.
it's too bad. It's too bad because it is a fascinating place with incredible history. But yeah, I share your thoughts. All right, just closing thoughts in this recovery. What are you looking forward to? What do you want to warn us about? Anything you want to add?
In the recovery, I'm looking forward to obviously more people on bike, fewer cars. That's happening. That's going to keep on going. I'm hoping that the pandemic was terrible in many ways, but the wonderful things about the pandemic is it taught people who live in historic cities like as I do, Rome, Paris, that um, that it's nice to reclaim your city again. I mean, one of my favorite things is to walk in historic Rome. I live right on the edge of it and go to the Trevi Fountain and be able to see it and hear the water, not hear tourists screaming at each other for selfies. And I'm hoping that'll put some local pressure against mass tourism. But I'm really hoping that we're going to get votes now for enlightened mayors like Anne Hidalgo of Paris, who sees a city that is built for locals and pedestrians and not for cars. And I think this will be a wonderful thing for everyone, tourists as well. But I think that movement really has got legs. Milan's doing it, Paris is doing it, London's trying to do it. Rome is sort of half-assing it, but it's a move in the right direction.
Well, Eric, thanks so much for joining us this morning. It's a sobering thing to hear your take on cities and tourism, but I think it'll be super helpful. I thank you for all your great work at the Globe. I think it's an outstanding newspaper, one of the best in the world still. And again, thanks for joining us this morning.
Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Bye bye.
Bye bye.